Hey everyone. So now that we've talked about all kinds of pop forces that are really cool because we can use them throughout the whole of Houdini, let's talk about a special one, and that is pop drag. Now this is a bit of a special force because, it depends a little bit on your taste if you want to use it or not. I would not necessarily say you have to use it. It's more like an option. And the idea of a pop drag is basically that you create stuff like air resistance. So if we look at a simple example here, a starburst, where I used a pop attract with a negative force scale, all it does is, points are pushed outwards, like if a star explodes. Now, in space, this would actually be correct because what's happening here, what's not happening, is that those points will never slow down. They will keep moving with the speed they have. So if you look closely at a single point, it never changes its speed. Now, that might sound familiar to you because what we will talk about right now is basically pop wind. So the pop drag, here it is, if I activate it, the way it is just results in the points moving and over time actually slowing down. And you can see that tends to feel quite natural, and maybe it feels a little bit like we're underwater or something. And this is exactly the thing. It's a bit up to you if you want to use that or not. Now, technically, of course, this happens everywhere in reality outside of space. So in the air, we have air resistance, right? That's why it's called that. Underwater, it's even stronger. So there it would make sense. But just to be clear, just because it's true in the physical world, it doesn't mean you always have to put it into your effects. A lot of effects.dd do that because it tends to look better, but a lot of effects.dds, me included, tend to overlook it or ignore that and say, okay, I don't like it because it makes my effect harder to control. So it's totally up to you. There is no rule or anything, which doesn't exist anyway, in our job, or what you have to do, but it's just something, a bit of a personal taste if you want to include it into your simulation or not. Technically, it's the most correct, but it's not a necessity. And you will actually see me not using this force much, even though a lot of senior effects.dds would argue that it's important. Now let's look at another example, and there you can kind of understand a little bit better why it's not absolutely necessary, in my opinion. And here is a simple pop curve force with a bit of a pop force noise, and then it creates the cool effect that we've seen before, that we follow a curve. Now, if I would just activate here a pop drag without changing anything, well, actually I did change something, the air resistance, then this would happen. All it would do with the whole thing is it would slow the points down. That's it. So it's up to you if you would decide this now looks more believable or not. The speed of the slowdown, just with a pop wind, is defined by the air resistance. So if I put this lower, then the speed of the slowdown will be lower. What it tries to do, again, just like the pop wind, and this is why it's called wind velocity, is it tries to reach this velocity, which is, by the way, actually visible in form of an attribute called target V. So if you look at the pop object and in the geometry spreadsheet, there's now actually an attribute called target V, which currently is not 0 because it's also driven by the pop curve force. But if I turn the pop curve force off, then it's 0. Now, and this comes from the pop drag because if I turn this off, it disappears. So as you can see, the concept of a target velocity is also there in other forces, and specifically in all the ones that have this checkbox turned on, tread as wind, where they take a certain number as a goal. So this is just a side note that this is specifically important for any drag-like forces. Now, what you already heard out of all this is you don't need to use pop drag. There's an alternative to this that we've already seen that works the exact same way, and that is pop wind. It also has a wind velocity, which is the goal velocity, and then the air resistance defines how strongly it tries to reach that goal, which in this case is a slowdown or air resistance effect, and this is the same that the pop drag does, and if you look at it, it basically looks the same. So the pop drag, you could say, is just a simpler version of the pop wind without the noise, and that is true. Nonetheless, you will often see people potentially use the pop drag in their simulation, and then you should understand what the goal of this is. It's about adding this little bit more realism that results in points slowing down and not constantly keep the same speed, because in everywhere else outside of space, that wouldn't be very natural. And the fact that this is actually an important concept you can tell, because when you look at later on, we haven't seen that yet, but when we look later at certain simulation types like Vellum or RBD, you can actually see that there's already a wind built into the system. So this is something you don't have to add. It's already built in and it's turned on by default. Same is true for RBD. In this case, it's not activated by default though, like in Vellum, but there is just a checkbox to activate it. So this concept of air resistance or drag is often very important to, again, give it the little bit more realism. Again, that doesn't mean you always have to use it, and you will actually see that in many cases I'm not using it at all, simply to keep the examples I show as simple as possible for you to understand concepts. But the pop drag is an important concept and you should keep it in mind. Okay, that much about the pop drag. Basically a pop wind, just with a different name. And I hope this is helpful. Thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.